recently I have decided that I need to spend more time on expressing myself through my quilting, and this is, in point of fact, my first attempt at marrying my passion for social justice with my love for quilting as an art medium. So it's not representative, it's heading off in a new direction.
To represent the history of both the strength it took them to just get through day to day, things that happened to them, the violence, the abuse.
Well, of course, with the AIDS thing, when everybody was dying and we were all making quilts for the memorial services there, and the AIDS project was, housed here in San Francisco, where I worked at San Francisco General. So I was making a lot of quilts with that.
I'm Yanniken Smucker, and welcome to Running Stitch, a QSOS podcast, and project of the nonprofit Quilt Alliance, supported by members and donors like you who believe in the power of documenting, preserving, and celebrating the stories of quilts and quilt makers. QSOS, Quilters Save Our Stories, the oral history project of the Quilt Alliance, has over 1,200 interviews with quilt makers and is archived with our partners at the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries and at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. If you are enjoying Season 3 of Running Stitch, I encourage you to go back and listen to any episodes you missed in Season 1 and 2. And if you like what you hear, please consider leaving Running Stitch a review on your favorite podcast service. On previous episodes of Running Stitch, we have heard from quilt artists who use quilts as part of their activist practices. You might listen back in Season 1 to our episodes featuring interviews with Carolyn Maslumi, Thomas Nauer, and Melanie Testa, and excerpts from QSOS interviews with other quilt makers who similarly make activist statements with their art. Today's guest, Sara Trail, follows in that tradition, and it is quite a tradition. Looking back to the 19th century, abolitionists, suffragists, and temperance activists all made quilts that espoused their beliefs, an essential outlet, particularly during a time in which women could not vote or run for political office. Quilters continued this practice of using quilts in their activism into the 20th century, projecting their opinions and supporting causes, sometimes even raising money, with Red Cross quilts, quilts celebrating New Deal programs, and quilts supporting political and social causes of various stripes. Again, in the late 20th century, quilts emerged as a potent symbol of the feminist movement. Also, loved ones memorialized those who had died of AIDS with quilt panels as part of the Names Project. And others advocated against nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and gun violence through their quilts. And quilts have remained an important means of communicating about racial injustice, a sad reminder that abolition, emancipation, and the civil rights movement have not, in fact, left us with a racially just society. Sara Trail and the nonprofit organization she founded in 2017, the Social Justice Sewing Academy, build further on these traditions. Sara has been sewing and making quilts since she was a child and transformed her work as a quilt maker and fashion designer into that of a community organizer. The Social Justice Sewing Academy has a mission to, quote, empower individuals to utilize textile art for personal transformation, community cohesion, and to begin the journey toward becoming an agent of social change, end quote. Sara co-authored with Teresa Duria Wong the Social Justice Sewing Academy book, which just came out this fall, Stitching Stolen Lives, focused on the Academy's Remembrance Project, which creates quilts to memorialize those who have lost their lives to social injustice, which we will hear more about today in our conversation. I'm honored to welcome Sara Trail as a guest on Running Stitch. You'll hear Sarah's foster daughter chattering at times during the interview, but that's no surprise, as we quilters are often multitasking, as Sara did during our conversation. Sara, thank you so much for being a guest.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited to be here. Excited about all the new things that have been happening with SGSA.
I am looking forward to hearing about them. So SJSA stands for, of course, the Social Justice Sewing Academy. Can you tell me a little bit about the origins of this organization?
Yes, I've been sewing since I was 4, and by the time I was 12, I had written a book with C&T and worked on a lot of just teaching projects to young kids on how to teach young kids to sew. So soon after leaving quilting and going into fashion design, what really changed my ideology was Trayvon Martin got murdered, and I made a quilt about him. And really, I was kind of met with like, I wouldn't even say silence, but almost hostility or like deliberate ignoring when I made that quilt. And the quilt industry didn't kind of welcome that in the same way that they welcomed, paper pieced quilts or double wedding ring quilts or more traditional style quilts. And so in making that quilt of Trayvon, I kind of realized, the ideologies of who I was as a young, Black student compared to some of the quilters that, I spent a lot of time with. I realized that we didn't all have the same, shared belief systems, priorities, and values. And so in that, I started creating SGSA after I graduated from Berkeley as a space where young people could make a quilt with their own ideas and their own, issues that they cared about.
So how would you define artivist?
I'd say an artivist is a hybrid of activist and artist, but really with the intent of using art to bring awareness, like a form of activism. So it's like a person who uses art as activism and really in ways to educate, the community, to amplify marginalized voices in the community. I think oftentimes people say, oh, you can use art and speak for those who don't have a voice. And like, I'd push back against that. I think everyone has a voice. Some are just more deliberately silenced or preferably left unheard.
So you said you kind of switched from quilt making to fashion. Did you study fashion in school?
No, I didn't. I went to a school that didn't really have much sewing opportunities at all. But my parents, I'm really blessed to have really amazing parents and more so middle class background where I had a fashion instructor named Laverne, who they paid for 3 years of me to get fashion design instruction.
Oh, that's pretty fantastic. Why do you think quilts and related textile arts are really good at doing the work of artivism, the community building as well as the actual more activism?
I think that quilting has historically always had quilting bees, and quilting has been a social activity and art form. So I think in bringing in young people, you can kind of create an intergenerational collaborative model where kids without, I wouldn't say without that much talent, but more so without that much experience, can make a beautiful art piece with someone who has a plethora and, years of experience on them. And so when you really combine the two of like youth voice, youth vision, youth intent, but with the mastery of, actual art quilters and quilters with, 10, 20 years experience using, fiber arts, it really, the techniques, the talent, the levels of detail, from French knots to stitches that kids could never really learn on their first piece. By allowing that collaboration, the artwork is really, truly not only one of a kind, but really just high caliber work with intent of like first time quilters.
So tell me about what some of those projects are at Social Justice Sewing Academy.
So we have workshops where we make blocks. And so we have 15-inch Kona cotton blocks. And in those blocks, we let kids do raw edge applique techniques where they're not embroidering it, but they're just gluing their artwork down and writing really detailed artist statements. And so then those raw blocks get sent to an embroidery volunteer who's an adult who signed up on our website. And so then upon the adult embroidering them, they come back to us and we sew them into an entire quilt. Then we also have longer term workshops where we let kids make their own art quilt, from their pattern design to creating their own quilt, to embroidering their own quilt, to then machine quilting their own quilt. They do the full, 6 weeks project. And then we also have just weekend workshops where kids will just make their own quilt top by themselves, and then we'll get it embroidered, et cetera, et cetera. And that'll be like a Friday through Sunday program.
Can you describe some of those the quilts that have resulted by some of the
issues? Yeah, so in our 6-week program, we've had quilts range on everything from police brutality, sexual misconduct, rape culture, gentrification, slut shaming, environmentalism. In some of our workshops where kids make blocks, we'll have one workshop with 70 kids and get a range of issue from drug trafficking to sex trafficking to saving trees, saving turtles, banning straws, homelessness, income inequality, gentrification, public schools inequities, school dress codes, prison to school pipeline. Really, the range of what comes out workshops is any and every social justice issue you could think of. And what kids make quilts on typically is more connected to a lived or personal experience that they've been through.
So are those quilts then, how do they work through the themes in their sewing?
They work through the theme. So it's really kind of like research informed art projects. So we do research, we have readings, we have curriculum, we have a guide where we can kind of scaffold what's the root of the issue, what are the leaves or the trunk of the issue, using a tree analogy, and really let them kind of just map out, what's upholding these issues, what's causing these issues, how can we work on fixing these issues, if it's going to be a grassroots solution or a policy solution, or does everyone need to more know about these issues so then we can work on fixing the issues. Really, it's kind of, what they think and, how they would want to see it solved. It's not like SGSA is like a policy class that's teaching everyone. Well, it could all go down to voting, but it's more so just giving them the tools to become, an engaged social citizen more than anything. Like, yes, use your art to become an artivist, but then, do something about it. You don't have to wait till you graduate college to, help the community. So it's like we've given kids $1,000. One of them made an urban garden. And so like they were able to grow fruits and vegetables and then give it out to community members. Some of them did like food drives and they cooked meals for homeless encampments or houseless communities nearby. So it's really just kind of giving kids the tools to be like, you can do something before you become quote unquote an adult. Kids are waiting to become older to do something. And it's like, regardless of your age, everyone has ideas, but it's like, do they have support? Do they have adults that believe in them? Do they have money? Do they have resources? Kids have ideas and time, but without those extra resources, ideas can't turn into reality.
So I am really curious about the actual, the objects that result from these workshops. I can tell that it's a lot more about the process and the journey and the gaining these tools as you've so clearly described. But when they actually make a piece, what happens to that? How do they use it in part of their activism or personal growth?
Yeah, no. So we get the piece made, and then the first thing is get it seen. We always make sure quilts are initially seen wherever the community that made it. So if a group of Oakland High kids make the quilt, we'll reach out to the Oakland High libraries, community centers, art centers, exhibit spaces, and really have an exhibit where the kids are brought back as the featured artists of the exhibit. They give an artist talk, and that's really their first audience. Or even if we pair with a local quilt show, we'll make sure that all the high school kids that have made quilts, in the Bay Area, we'll have the quilts in the local Bay Area quilt show. All the artists will be invited back. And then that quilt guild, those audience of the quilt show will be their audience to talk about. My name's Maria. I made this quilt about XYZ. This XYZ means this to me. And so really just an opportunity to not only narrate their artist statement, but really practice levels of, autonomy, agency, and empowerment on being bold enough and proud enough to speak about, what they made their art about. And then really have an audience that does have a listening ear. For the most part, most quilters will really listen to what kids are saying. And they'll care. And it's like they're a kind audience, they're a gentle audience. And so whether or not they agree can be a different subject, but quilters are going to treat young kids who've made quilts pretty nice. And so it gives them just an opportunity to have their voices heard. And that affirmation is so priceless.
Can you tell me a little more about those partnerships with guilds or quilt guilds or other quilt artists working in your area?
Yeah, so we have Cloth Carousel, who's a quilt shop in Vacaville, who gives us space to host 2 or 3 sew days per month. So they have an amazing fabric shop, and then they have like a classroom shop, and we have free sew days. Obviously they're free. We provide lunch, and we bring kids blocks, and we bring everything, and people just come with their sewing machines, and we just have these fun community days of people who don't know each other all coming together to work on these collaborative pieces with the blocks that the kids have made. We also have, quilt mentors like Martha Wolf, who's a SACWA mentor, who's an amazing art quilter who helps us design quilts. We have Nancy Williams, who's a local long armor, who long arms, I'd say a majority of SGSA work. We've got dozens on dozens of kids. We've got Janine LeBate, an amazing San Francisco educator who helps us lead workshops. We've got Lauren in LA, who's our executive director of SGSA, who's a 25-year-old phenomenon, who's like a school psychologist who really helps with the mental aspect, not only in building out in our curriculum, but the mental health aspect of sometimes, the art and the workshops we do can arise triggers or, stir up trauma that kids have had and often left unprocessed. So we have a really holistic team. We've got a volunteer named Stephanie who does all of our exhibits. So if anyone reaches out like, hey, I'm a library coordinator, I want an exhibit, we all kind of have different roles. And as you say, is 100% volunteer led. So to have all these people just willing to volunteer their time really kind of speak to not only the mission of how much they believe in it, but really reflective of the, not only like we just have really kind people, really aware people and people willing to use their time, talent, and opportunity to amplify voices, because all these people are volunteering on these quilt, really the kids artists are the main ones that are going to be featured. So we're all selflessly working and donating our time, skills to piece it together. But really it's about featuring the artist. Because if we listed, for example, in one community quilt, which has 20 kids blocks, embroidered by 20 volunteers, pieced by 15 other volunteers. But when the quilt is seen, it will say embroidered by SGSA volunteers, pieced by SGSA volunteers. Here are the 20 kids and their names and their artist statements. So out of the 60 people who've made this one quilt possible, the only ones whose names are attributed to the quilt are really the 20 kids. So that's kind of what I mean by the selfish aspect. And I think often in sewing, credit is always so important, and people sew because they want, their portfolio to expand or and I think that a lot of people come to SGSA really with this selfless, dedication to not only amplifying youth voice, but really using their talent to collaborate with a kid who they don't even know. And I think that level of just anonymously just pairing and volunteering it's a really powerful collaboration to watch.
Let's listen to an excerpt from a QSOS interview with Joy Major, conducted by Karen Musgrave in 2009. This interview was one from a series of interviews conducted with women who were imprisoned in the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, Ohio. The women who participated in the interviews each made quilts as part of a collaboration with the textile art nonprofit Sacred Threads.
I was invited by Chaplain Burns, she works at our religious service department, to work with the quilt project with Sacred Threads. And at first, I wasn't so sure I wanted to do it because it stirs up a lot of emotions and a lot of old past stuff I wasn't sure I wanted to deal with. And I talked to Dr. Tinch over at Mental Health, and she thought it would be an awesome idea and offered to support me in any way she could, where she could, when I worked on the project. So I tried to come up with a title and a quilt that would be in some way part of my journey here. So I thought Hands of Time because to me it was all about expressing what time here is like, time before I got here and even time into the future. So I thought Hands of Time would be able to illustrate that for me. And I wrote this little poem about Hands of Time, and it's the way that the hands turn slowly here, and if I could turn the hands back, things would be a lot differently. And as I started working on it, I found it so unusual that even though I've been here for 12 years, some days the time passed so quickly that I can't believe it's been. And then other times it seems like one day can be an eternity. So I started to pick out material and stuff for my quilt, and the most obvious piece that I found was this brick wall. And to me, the brick just represented a stopping point, a confinement of it all. So I worked around it, and I put the brick on, and then I started thinking about the clock. So I put the clock on, and I used each little scrap of material that we could find because all of the things that we had here was donated in some kind of way. So I collected all of the beige or the white pieces, and I tried to make it as diverse as possible because I found that the people here are just that. Everybody is so individual. So I began stitching these pieces together, and I didn't know how to quilt. I had made a couple quilting projects before that. I didn't have any lessons for quilting, that's probably obvious, but I decided just to start sewing it together how I thought it would go together.
I'd love to hear your reaction to Joy describing her process and how she, was wrestling with her personal situation through her sewing.
Yeah, I'd say the way that, certain fabric, arise different emotion and what it symbolized to her. I think, as a person, living behind bars, unfortunately, you do see something very different when you see brick. I think working in a jail and I've done a lot of workshops in juvenile hall, for some people, brick does mean stopping and barriers. And for some, bricks mean nice houses and gentrification. And for some, bricks mean police buildings. And I think that, everyone's lived experience really comes through with their personal statement on what they choose to make art about. An experience that I can share from one young girl, her name is Brianna. She found this fabric, and the fabric was like an orangish, tannish fabric, and it depicted a lot of white people playing golf, polo, rugby, riding horses, kind of like sports. And I remember her like seeing the fabric, and she was like, "Sarah, what does this mean to you?" And I was like, "People playing sports." She's like, "No, like, what does this fabric mean to you? Like, look at it closer." I'm like, white people only playing sports. The fabric had no difference in skin tone. She's like, "No, it's not even about skin tone. This is privilege. Kids, we don't get access to these sports. These are rich people's sports." So for her, it meant money, it meant affluence, it meant whiteness, and for me, it was just, a basic fabric that had silhouettes of people and like, kind of like a mid-century modern, but for her, I guess it wasn't basketball or football or soccer or the sports that were accessible to her. Those are sports that she'd seen or heard about, but never had experience playing. And so even in, my experience, she wasn't much younger than me, but she had a very different, experience and interpretation of what that fabric was. And so I think in SGSA, everyone's interpretation of what the fabric is and what their art means is heard, is valid, is listened to, and more importantly, is amplified through the collaborative process.
Why do you think quilts specifically are good for activism? I'll pose that question now, but I'm gonna play this clip from Marjorie Freeman. She's a quilt maker who entered a piece in the Quilts for Obama exhibit, which was back in 2008. 2009 was really the exhibit when after his inauguration. And women, just a little background on this project, women were invited, not just women, quilt makers were invited to create pieces in celebration of the first African-American president in the United States. And it's a really diverse group of quilts for sure, but the QSOS project interviewed a number of the contributors to the project.
So tell me about the words that appear in the centers of the stars.
Okay, with pleasure. In the upper left-hand corner, there's the words social and economic justice for all. I feel that that is one of the campaign issues that President Obama was putting forth. And that is one of the things that he is really working for now. He is facing some terrible problems right now in our country with the economy being what it is. But he realizes that it's going to take a lot of time. But I felt that that is one of the problems in America right now, that there is not equality across the board for everybody. And I think that was one of the appeals to the general population. And that was one of his one of his platforms. And I think he's working toward that. That was one group. That was in one star. And then on the right, there's one that says, a more perfect union. His speech in Philadelphia, I think I mentioned that earlier, addressed racism. And in that speech, I think they called it we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, it's actually a quote. It's not an original at all. And it's a quote from the Constitution. This is what he wants for our country. It's nothing new. You know, we can always do better. America can always improve itself. We have gotten better as the years have gone on. That Constitution was written when slavery was very much in vogue. It was alive, it was well, and there are issues now that still we have to embrace. There are problems of racism still exists. We still have issues of immigration to address, and there are other problems in our country. And so we are still working toward a more perfect union. It's not a perfect country. We still have flaws. And so therefore, I felt that the fact that he realizes this and he's interested in doing things a little differently. He wants a different approach. I felt that this is something that I had to include in one of the stars. And another star, the one in the middle, Unified America. I feel that people really want to be unified.
Marjorie is clearly using the quilt as a medium for activism as well. And there's many, many more examples of quilt makers who have done that. And that's clearly, you're drawing on that great tradition. Why do they make such a, on one hand, it's like almost contradictory that a quilt, which is such a soft tactile object, would actually be making this bold political statement, in this case about race and civil rights, or in the case of your quilt about Trayvon Martin, making a statement about violence against African Americans. Why does this work?
I'd say really because it's subversive art. I think that you hit it kind of on the head. Quilts are often meant for comfort. When a baby's born, a quilt. When you get married, a quilt. But often when people get killed, no one gives them a quilt. But often, quilts can be seen for comfort. And so I think that when you use a medium that everyone is familiar with, and most people, like if you do a quilt, people think warm, fuzzy feelings, or a quilter, or, et cetera, et cetera. But really kind of using harsh, or not even harsh, but just honest, transparent, raw messages on something that people perceive as hard or soft, like they're using a hard message on a soft medium. It really, can often open up the eyes, and then most importantly, the heart. I think that, a lot of messages that, these kids are putting on quilts and art, are really kind of shaking up some of the quilters who might not see it in their community. I think that's often the beauty of collaboration. Just because it's not happening near you doesn't mean it's not happening, other places. And as MLK said, a threat to justice, for you is a threat to my justice, and a threat, anywhere. I think the intersectionality of our identities are kind of the metaphor for like Jen Hewitt's new book, A Long Connecting Thread, I believe. But it's kind of like we are all one fabric and fiber. And as Reverend Jackson so eloquently said in the foreword of my new book, America is not just like a melting pot. It's really like a patchwork quilt. And everyone has different fabrics and textures and colors. And no one wants to melt them all down into being one cloth. No one wants a blanket of one, but a patchwork quilt represents and reflects and really respects and highlights the differences and all the fabric composition of color makeup, of size, of religion, of orientation, of preference, just all of it. The intersectionality of your identity is really seen in a patchwork quilt because every piece is different, but the beauty of them all together is what makes the quilt the quilt. And so I really, kind of feel like America is a patchwork quilt. And when we have a community sewing circle coming together to make this quilt, when you're talking about art, whose art is valuable, who gets art exhibits, how many art exhibits has a general person been to of makers younger than 18? Not many. And so I think when you're kind of pushing the narrative and pushing the dichotomy on whose art is valued, whose art needs to be seen, what does it mean to be an artist? For many, you have to do art for 10 plus years to become an artist. And that, a lot of kids don't have that experience or that resume or even that repertoire. And I think often, if you really want to go deeper into the politics of quilting and sewing, it's really often boils down to the privilege of time, the privilege of resources, and the privilege of who has the time, hours to make something that costs more in time, materials, and labor to make it than it does to buy it. Because unfortunately, exploited sweatshop labor, a quilt from Target can be $40, $50, but a handmade quilt, runs easily up $700, not to mention if we want to accurately price, the things we make. And I remember a really good meme that I saw, kind of floating on some of the quilters pages that I follow. When we underprice or undervalue our own work, it brings the entire market down for everyone. And so I think in SJSA, we don't sell work. We only make art to be seen. It's like this free community lending library forever. But really, it's like when these kids have made this work, when these volunteers have put in hours, it's priceless in the sense of people wouldn't value the price if we had to add a price tag. So it's like, it's not even about selling the art, it's about seeing the art. It's about, being bigger than just making a quilt. We're not making quilts to go on beds or to be folded up in storage forever. We're really making art to be seen by the community that made it and beyond.
That's really powerful. And what struck me in your comments there are in this collaboration between the kids and, older adult quilt makers who are volunteering. The kids are not the only ones learning.
100%. Learning occurs not simultaneously, because obviously the workshop happens and then the embroidery process happens and then the sew day process happens, but everyone learns at their own stage in relation and in proximity to their participation in these SJSA community projects.
That's fantastic. You mentioned, I believe, as well in the last few moments, your new book or forthcoming book.
Yeah, it just came out in September.
What's the title?
Stitching Stolen Lives. And so it's kind of like a Humans of New York social justice sewing version, but it's really like a coffee table art activism book, similar to the AIDS project that talks about the SJSA Remembrance Project that is highlighting lives of those who had their life stolen, featuring makers from everywhere in the US. We have like a banner project going on where we're making banners in honor of people who've lost their lives to community violence, to death by law enforcement, LGBTQIA violence, domestic violence, racially motivated hate crimes, and etc. And so we just assign their name to a volunteer. The volunteer will take the name and make a banner 20.5 by 24 inches. And then they'll ship us that raw block. And we, as a large community behind the scenes in the Bay Area, will turn the blocks into banners that are beautifully long-armed, points cut, bind, and sleeved banners that the community can use and borrow at large for their own efforts. And so really the Remembrance Project is far more focusing on who they were and the humanity of, what they like to do and who they were before their final moment. So really the task is on the researcher and the artivist who's going to, make the block to research, what were they like? Find the Facebook page, find the family's page. What did they post about? What photos were shared? Maybe fishing was their favorite activity. Maybe they love the beach or go-kart riding or, whatever you did. And so in making the banners, it's really about writing a comprehensive artist statement that sum up, who they were and not, their final moments before their life was stolen.
Can you speak a little bit more about how the Names Project, the AIDS Memorial Quilt, influenced some of this work?
Yeah, so I had a group of kids in the Bay at the peak kind of COVID. And we took them to San Francisco and Oakland because the AIDS quilt was showing. And so I was like, I want you guys to get some quilt history. So we did an at-lib field trip, texted a few of the kids who come to workshop. We all met at BART. We went over, and as the kids saw the quilts, they were like, wow, like first off, they're huge. Second off, they're gorgeous. And then third off, their next question was, well, who's doing one for all of the Black people that are getting killed? And who's doing one for all the people in Oakland that are getting killed, or San Francisco, or all of the homeless, or the domestic violence, and just all these other people who also need their lives memorialized in a large quilt? And I'm like, well, the AIDS quilt is very specific on who gets honored. And I was like, but if you guys want to start your own project, go through. And then they're like, well, we don't know how to sew, but we have a lot of names. Let's figure it out. And so really kind of inspired by the young people who saw the AIDS quilt. It was just kind of like we went back and we're like, okay, so how do we want to do it? At first, like, let's make big panels. And I'm like, that doesn't even seem feasible to transport. Let's make smaller panels, and what size and how would we piece them? And so really the young people and I, we just had a few brainstorm sessions. We started coming up with a list of who we wanted to memorialize, starting with some of the names that were flooding our timelines: Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, like some of the huge names. And then as those names came in, we realized in the Bay Area, Sean Montrose, Stephen Taylor, like there's so many local names of people who didn't even get media time that have also been killed. And then, the young girl in Wyoming was killed by her boyfriend. Like there's all sorts of people that are getting killed, and not everyone, will get their 5 minutes of fame posthumously. But it's really kind of about like, well, we can't just be a one size fits all. Let's have a much broader category. So as people, regardless of how they pass, if their life gets stolen, let's memorialize them. And so really that's the key. The criteria is, did their life get stolen? So someone, for example, who, may have committed suicide, they wouldn't be necessarily honored in this project because their life wasn't stolen. They, perhaps took it themselves. But really anyone whose life gets stolen, and that's honoring, everyone from police officers to community members. It's lives that are stolen. If your life was taken by someone else, then your life was stolen.
So let's finish up with, I'd like to hear what's next on the horizon, either for you personally as a maker and sewer and as the organization.
I'd say personally, I'm really excited for this collaboration we have with this new artist. Can't wait to share that. But as an org, I'm really excited for QuiltCon, which will be in February. Excited to bring high school kids there to see a quilt show, to experience a quilt show, touch fabric, meet quilters, see quilts, and most importantly, create their own. Outside of that, we've got a lot of exhibits in 2022 planned. So excited for SGSA to be in other spaces. We've got Chicago and Florida and a few other places. And then more importantly, I'm really excited for the scalability. Lauren, our executive director, is really strategic and like organizational capacity building kind of focused. And so scaling up and train the trainers, where we're going to have like these Zoom sessions of pre-recorded stuff where other people can become a certified SGSA instructor and do it, so as workshops come in of like in Michigan and Ohio and New York, all asking for the same workshop in 1 week, we can have a broader base of volunteers who've been trained, who can go to these workshops in person as requested.
That sounds pretty amazing. It's great to see how you're growing. It sounds like you have a lot of really important work ahead. It's exciting. Well, thank you so much, Sara, for joining me as a guest on Running Stitch. I can't wait to share this interview with our listeners.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Visit our episode page to learn more about the Social Justice Sewing Academy and to hear more about their upcoming exhibitions and workshops, including at QuiltCon in February. Running Stitch, a QSOS podcast, is a project of the Quilt Alliance, a member-supported national nonprofit dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing the stories of quilts and quilt makers. Running Stitch is hosted and written by me, Yannick Smucker, and I serve as co-producer with QSOS project manager Emma Parker, with support from Quilt Alliance executive director Amy Milne. This podcast is generously funded by the Robert and Artist James Foundation. QSOS oral history interviews are archived with our partners, the Louis B. Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries and at the Library of Congress American Folklife Center. You can listen to full interviews and see photos of quilts at our website, qsos.quiltalliance.org. Running Stitch features music by Chris Eselgroth, accompanied by a singer featherweight, and Amy's Best Sewing Shears.